Well, good evening, Brennan, and welcome to the 17th Lodge Hope of Karachi Zoom meeting during the current COVID-19 pandemic. It's a pleasure to welcome you all back along this Tuesday evening as we move towards progression for potentially some light at the end of the tunnel. We've seen just this week some announcements from the United Grand Lodge of England on what they see our future could be for meetings, and no doubt in due course we will have some direction from the Grand Lodge of Scotland. But in the meantime, Lodge Hope of Karachi will continue to provide a weekly insight into Freemasonry for you. As ever, can I remind you of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidance that I need you to keep your videos on with your names on the screen, so I can vouch that you are Freemasons. I would encourage you all to sign the virtual tile within the Lodge Hope of Karachi Facebook pages, and there will be questions and answers with this evening's speaker afterwards, and I would ask you to put those into the chat room. So, Brent, I'm delighted to welcome virtually this time a brother back to the province of Fife and Kinross, Brother Mike Neville, who is a retired Scotland Yard detective, chief inspector. Mike is an expert on the history of the craft and the history in particular of crime. And I'm not saying that because crime and the craft go together, but I'm sure Mike will explain all that over the next 40 minutes or so, although there are a few dodgy characters on my screen this evening. And as a result of that, he travels around the world assisting police forces and giving lectures in lodges. Mike's also world renowned for his ability to catch criminals with CCTV using super recognizers. He is author of Sacred Secrets, Freemasonry, the Bible and the Christian Faith, and holds the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Cadet Force, as well as being the National Training Officer for music.
Colonel these days, look, full Colonel.
Are you full Colonel? I apologise, Colonel. I apologise. So it gives me the greatest of pleasure, Colonel, to hand over the floor to you this evening to talk to us about one of your passions.
Okay, thank you so much, Gordon, and good evening, brethren. Some of you I've probably met, and it's always a pleasure to visit Scotland, which I consider to be the place where Freemasonry, as we practice today, originated. So my talk today, as Gordon has said, is on crime and the craft. I'm going to show some pictures. I've always tried and bespoke it, so I've included some Scottish goodies and some Scottish baddies, and you can see the influence of Scottish Freemasons on crime and the like. So I'm going. I think. Can I share? You'll have to allow me to share a screen, Gordon.
You should be able to share your screen.
No, it's disabled. You might have to change me to the host. If you go on the right side, you might have to change me to be the host to do that.
There you go.
Thank you so much. Oh, where's my thing gone then? Yeah, let me see. Where's he? I'm trying to find my. Why isn't my PowerPoint coming up on the screen?
You should be able to share, and you've
definitely. I've got it on my screen right now. Let me have a look. I don't know why this is not happening, actually. Let me get rid of some. Bear with me, Gordon, a second. I'll get rid of some stuff, and I'll see if it comes up if I get rid of. Forgive me messing around like this, brethren. It doesn't usually happen like this, though. I've got it there.
Yeah, we can see that coming up now, Mike.
Yeah, you can see it. Okay, and I'm going to. Right, you can see that, brethren. Sorry about that. So as you can see, there's the cover of my book. As Gordon said, I'm a sort of Masonic historian, and I love the history of crime. So let me take you through some interesting stories. You may not be aware, but forgive there's any crazy noises, but the most senior Scottish Freemason, and by default, really, the most senior British Freemason to be executed was the Earl of Kilmarnock, who was the Grand Master, as you can see, in 1742. The Earl of Kilmarnock threw in his lot with Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was on the Jacobite side, whilst his son was on the government forces side. Now, the Earl of Kilmarnock retreated all the way back. He retreated. Oh God, sorry, he retreated all the way back to Culloden, and he was riding round on his horse. And he thought he was riding into his regiment, but he wasn't. He made a mistake. It was a bad mistake. He rode into the government's forces side, and he was captured. And he was actually tried in Southwark. He was executed on Tower Hill. You can see the plaque on the left-hand side where it shows where he's executed. And as an earl, he was the most senior earl. So the privilege of such was that he got to go first, and he was very contrite. And he apologised for his wickedness on the scaffold, and he put his head down, and with one blow of the axe, his head was chopped off. Now, the next to go was the Earl of Balmerino, who wasn't a Freemason, but he got on in the scaffold and made all sorts of rude gestures, declared his support for Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite cause. And when he put his head down, it took 3 blows of the axe to chop his head off. So I think the lesson there, brethren, if somebody's going to chop your head off, keep your mouth shut, because you're never going to win the argument. But moving on, this is the Scottish influence, for good and bad, on Scotland Yard. So in Scotland Yard, originally it was formed in 1829. And there wasn't a detective department until 1846, when somebody tried to murder Queen Victoria. But the detective department was very small, and it had 4 chief inspectors. Now, in the 1870s, a man called William Kerr, who you can see in the centre, was originally from Dunblane. He was a Scottish Freemason, and he was a very clever swindler. And he teamed up with a man called Harry Benson, who you can see in the middle left, who wasn't a Freemason. But Benson was a swindler as well, and he spoke several European languages. And they hit upon a scheme where they were going to bribe jockeys to win or lose. But what they told the people, of course, is that they had a top tipster. And they relied on people's greed, really. In the police, it's called a long firm fraud. So what you do is you take people into your confidence. So people would put money on 2, 3, 4 times. They'd always pay out the bets, and they waited to people to get greedy, and they put on a load of money, and they would steal the money. Now, to do this, they needed a premises, and the office you can see in Northumberland Street, top left, it still exists. It's near Charing Cross today. And that office was owned by a man called Flintoff, who was also a Freemason. And to rent it, they obtained the services of Edward Froggatt, you can see him middle centre, who was a London Freemason and a dishonest solicitor. Who could believe such a thing existed? And they moved into that premises there, and they were absolutely making a fortune. At one point, a French woman put £40,000 on a horse, which they stole. Now, that's worth about £1 million today. And what he would do, Kerr in particular, he would get the train from King's Cross up to Edinburgh, launder the money into Scottish banknotes, which he thought were untraceable, and then come back. So it was a very sophisticated criminal scheme. But they knew if they carried on, the police would show some interest. And literally across the road from Northumberland Street is the original Scotland Yard. And there were employed there were 4 chief inspectors, who you can see in the corners, Meiklejohn, Drusovich, Palmer and Clark. Meiklejohn was also a Scotsman. He was originally from near Stirling. He is possibly the most corrupt detective ever at Scotland Yard. He received thousands of pounds in bribes from Kerr in property, gold, cash and jewellery to keep quiet or warn Kerr off of any police interest. If you go on the internet, it'll say Meiklejohn was a Freemason. He certainly wasn't a Freemason. But he also corrupted Chief Inspector Drusovich, who you can see top right, and he also received thousands of pounds to warn off the villains. And allegedly he corrupted Chief Inspectors Clark and Palmer, who were Freemasons in London. As it was, Kerr was eventually arrested. He was arrested by a man called John Littlechild, who was a Freemason. He was a very good detective in his later years, who formed what's now the Special Branch or Anti-Terrorist Squad. Kerr was arrested. He was taken to the Magistrates' Court. You can see bottom left. And at the magistrates' court, the dishonest solicitor Froggatt approached him and said, Brother Kerr, this is to Flintoff, who's the mason who owns it. Brother Kerr is a mason in distress. If you give evidence against him, he'll go to jail. Now, what did Flintoff do? Well, Flintoff took the right path and said, sir, he is a scoundrel who does not deserve to be a Freemason. He gave his evidence, and Kerr went to prison with Benson. But they were offered a deal that if you give evidence against the alleged corrupt officers in this, you will get a lighter sentence. And this follows the 1877 trial of detectives. This is the first ever police corruption trial. So I'm just going to click on my screen. Oh. And so the evidence against Meiklejohn and Drusevich was damning. They'd received lots of cash and property and jewels over a long period of time in several payments. The evidence against Chief Inspectors Palmer and Clark was not so much. Clark seems to be dragged into it because he is he's one of the four. The evidence against Palmer was that at a date and time, he'd sent a telegram in a false name to Kerr and Benson, telling them that the police were interested in them. Now, at the Old Bailey, this is where the most Masonic evidence has ever been given, I think, because at the Old Bailey, the secretary of the Dramatic Lodge, which met in the Strand, came to the meeting and said there's no way that Palmer could have sent that telegram, because at the date and time on that telegram, he was at a lodge meeting and he was the junior warden who sat opposite me as secretary, and he never left the lodge. And neither could Clark have sent it, because he was the inner guard at that meeting and he never left the lodge either. And 4 or 5 other members of Freemasonry who were at that lodge meeting came to the Old Bailey with the attendance register and said there's no way that they could have sent that telegram. And so I'm clicking on admit people. And so now we come to the jury. So who was guilty? Well, there's no doubts that Meiklejohn, the chap originally from Stirling, he was guilty for corruption, sent to prison. So was Drusevich. Clark was found not guilty. But surprisingly, given all the evidence from the Freemasons, Palmer was found guilty and sent to prison, which I think is badly treated. But as a result of this case, the entire detective department was disbanded and the CID was formed. So that's the CID owes its origins to a very corrupt detective, Meiklejohn, and Kerr being a Scottish Freemason. But let me turn to a goody Scottish Freemason now. And of course, the most famous crime that Scotland Yard has ever investigated is the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888. Now, we really don't know how many murders Jack the Ripper committed. In this day and age, we'd have a far better idea. And there's all sorts of Masonic conspiracy theories. When it says the provincial Grand Master of Berkshire down there, that's Prince Albert Victor. And what's claimed is that he married a Catholic, which was illegal, had a child, the prostitutes know about it, and there was a Masonic conspiracy to bump them off. I mean, luckily we can prove that this conspiracy was a load of nonsense. But let me tell you some of the Freemasons actually involved in this case. So Sir Charles Warren, who was made a Freemason in Gibraltar, he was the Commissioner of the Police, and also Right Worshipful Brother, he'd been the District Grand Master out in Singapore. The Coroner, Baxter, he was certainly a Freemason in London and Sussex, and heavily criticised the police as bungling and stupid. And having been in the Metropolitan Police for a long time, I can suggest that he may have been right, actually. The Lord Mayor of London, De Keyser, was Belgium originally, but a Freemason, London Freemason, and he was the Lord Mayor until the day of the last murder, if you want a conspiracy. And so was this man. This is George Lusk. He was the chairman of the Vigilance Committee. Now, if you watch a Ripper film, they're often portrayed as some kind of communist vigilantes, but they weren't. In reality, they were local shopkeepers who didn't really want murders affecting business. And Brother Lusk was a member of the local Doric Lodge, which then met in the East End. Just a second, Abigail, close that down, please. So I'm just going to shut the door. Children with loud things. And Brother Lusk received this letter from hell, which is, if you know the Johnny Depp film, this is where the title came from. Dear Mr. Lusk, here's half a kidney, other half I ate and fried. Now, to me, if Jack the Ripper was a Freemason, surely he would have signed it to yours sincerely and fraternally, Jack the Ripper, but he obviously didn't. But this kidney, of course, ended up at the London hospital. If you think of crime today, we could have got DNA or fingerprints from that, from either the victim or the offender, and we certainly could have done toxicology. In 1888, they could just about say it was a human kidney, so it just shows the level of it. But in my inquiries into this case, I found over 40 Freemasons involved in the Jack the Ripper case as suspects, as witnesses, as police officers, as detectives, as doctors, as coroners, as whatever else. Now, does that mean there's a Masonic conspiracy, or is it simply Victorian society where lots of men were Freemasons? I suggest the latter. But you may have heard in the press that it was solved. And this man on the left is a Scottish Freemason. This is Donald Swanson. He was he's a Scottish craft and also advanced the mark in Thurso. But he came to London as a detective. Now imagine in 1888 coming from the Highlands of Scotland into London as it was, and working in the East End. It must have been quite an incredible change, really. But he was a very good detective, Swanson. Did all sorts of famous cases in his days. But he would have been called the senior investigating officer. So he was at Scotland Yard, and everything about the Jack the Ripper case came through him. And he reported direct to the assistant commissioner. And when the assistant commissioner retired, he wrote his autobiography. And in that autobiography, he said this: unsolved murders are very rare in London, and Jack the Ripper is not in that category. So what he's basically saying is it was solved. But then he said, I cannot name the killer. Now, that book, a copy of that book, was handed to Brother Swanson as a gift. And 100 years later, his great-grandson was looking through that book, and he saw all sorts of pencil notes that Swanson had written. And where the assistant commissioner said, I cannot name the killer, Brother Swanson has said, Kosminski was the suspect. So who was Kosminski? Well, Kosminski was a Polish Jew, a man of little consequence, really. And I want you to imagine how the police solved crime in 1888. So that, as I've said, there was no fingerprints, there was no DNA, there's no toxicology to speak of, no CCTV in my expertise. In fact, there was very little. But they did have detectives, and a Freemason who worked, Willie Clarkson, who worked at the Drury Lane Theatre Lodge, would help to disguise these detectives, and they followed Kosminski around for 3 days. Now, unfortunately, he was mad, and he was found masturbating every day in public, so he's just crazy, so they just locked him up in an asylum. But that shawl you can see in the middle there, they did DNA analysis on it, and that shawl was supposed to belong to Catherine Eddowes, who was a victim of the Ripper on the 30th of September 1888. And on it, they say they found blood, which DNA can be matched to one of Kosminski's relatives who is alive today. And there's blood which matches Eddowes' relatives, and there's semen on it which matches one of Kosminski's relatives who's alive today. So it sounds very conclusive, but the DNA is only 1 in 10,000. If I was involved in a murder, it'd be 1 in a billion. But the facts are that if the Jack the Ripper case was solved, it was solved by Brother Swanson, who is a Scottish Freemason and also a London Mark Mason. But moving on, when I can click my screen, this is possibly the most famous case in the sense that it's entered into mythology, really. So this is Frederick Seddon here, who was a Mason initiated in Liverpool. Now, being from near Manchester, I can tell you that I know that all Scousers are really bad, so nothing surprises me here. So he moved to Buckinghamshire and then to London. And he was quite a greedy man, really. He loved gold coins, and he fell in with this eccentric spinster called Eliza Barrow, who owned the Buck's Head pub, which you can see there, which is in Camden Market in London. And she owned the shop next door, and she had lots of money and gold coins. And Seddon made her a deal. He said, look, you've got too much to worry about here, all these assets. So if you come and live in my house, which you can see Tollington Road there next to him, which still exists, if you come to my house, my family will feed you every day. We'll give you an allowance every week. And in true murder style, we'll look after you for as long as you shall live, which, of course, is not very long at all, because what Seddon did is he bought some fly paper, and from that you extract arsenic, and he put into the he put into his arsenic into that medicine bottle you can see on the right, which is still at Scotland Yard now, and he gave her one massive dose of arsenic and killed her basically, and she buried her very quickly. After a week, the relatives of Eliza Barrow came asking, "Look, where's the will?" And he told them to clear off, which they weren't satisfied with. So they went to Scotland Yard, who called in Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, later Sir Bernard Spilsbury, you can see in the centre, who was his first big case was on the Crippen case, and he came to the New York Times, described him as the real Sherlock Holmes. And also William Wilcox is his superior, who was also one of the top pathologists of the day. They were both Freemasons. If you're thinking of bumping off the missus with arsenic, this is not the proper way to do it. I might show you the correct way in a short while. But they exhumed the body and quickly proved it was arsenic, and he was brought to trial. He's brought to trial at the Old Bailey in front of his honour, Sir Thomas Bucknell, who you can see there. And that's Right Worshipful Brother Sir Thomas Bucknell, the Provincial Grand Master of Surrey. So the scene is set now that the Old Bailey, you've got the Masonic murderer in the dock, and you've got the Masonic judge presiding. And Seddon was found guilty. And this photograph here is unique. It is the only photograph taken of a sentence in the Old Bailey. They think that a woman had a camera concealed in her hat to take this photograph. And if we look to the left, you can see the police officer in the dock, and in front of him is Seddon with his bald head. And if we look to the right, at the chair, you can see Judge Bucknell, Right Worshipful Brother Bucknell, with the black cap on his head. This is the moment of sentence where he said, as judges do, "Have you anything to say before I pronounce a sentence of death?" And this is what it said happened. This is what Seddon did. And said, "By the great architect of the universe, I am not guilty of this crime." Now, Bucknell was taken aback by this, he's quite upset by this, but this is what he said: "Our brotherhood does not encourage crime, it condemns it," and sentenced him to death. And of course, the hangman said, "Step off with the left foot," but he didn't really. That's a myth, really. No hangmen were Masons in England for some reason. Apparently, they weren't allowed to be. But the problem is in the Scotland Yard Museum, there is a letter that Bucknell sent to a friend who I've traced to be a Freemason, saying, "I've been criticised by anonymous Masons for what I did. I think he did his duty." So if anybody says to you that Masons get off at court, you can say, "Do you know the case of Brother Seddon and Brother Bucknell?" And you'll have some evidence. But you remember I mentioned about the right way of bumping off somebody. This is probably the best, but this is Major Herbert Armstrong here, Worshipful Brother Armstrong, who was he was a solicitor in Hay-on-Wye. And he looks a bit like Crippen, actually, but he was a small, weedy man. And my police experience tells me that if you're small and weedy, you usually marry a big strapping woman, which he did. And she was quite a bully. And she bullied him, and he escaped, really. He was in the TA in the Great War. That's why he's a major. When he came back from France, she was at him again, bullying him. And so he escaped to the garden, and he didn't like dandelions, so he went to the chemist shop, and from a brother in his lodge, he bought some arsenic. And what he did, he put the arsenic in a little squirter gun, and he squirted the dandelions and killed them. But that's not all he did. He kept some of the arsenic back, and every day he put a tiny bit in his wife's food, just a tiny bit every day. So over a period of time, a long period of time, his wife went sort of slightly mad, and then she went even more mad, and then she went completely mad. And of course, with women, of course, this is difficult to tell sometimes. And then she died, and that was the finish of her. But no one suspected a thing. Everybody felt sorry for him, and he was widowed, and it's a tragedy. But all this did was embolden him, and he thought, "Ha, I've got away with this." And now he thinks, well, there are two solicitors on Hay-on-Wye, and it'd be far better for the business if there was only one. And this is where, brethren, I feel he crosses the line, because the other solicitor he intends to bump off is a brother Mason. I mean, it's one thing for somebody to kill their wife, but to kill a brother Mason, that's outrageous, isn't it? But anyway, so the first attempt at killing the other solicitor is he sent a box of chocolates to the family. And the family all ate them, and they're all violently ill, but not dead. And when they were later examined, every chocolate had a little hole in the bottom, which matched the dandelion squirter gun. Having failed in that endeavour, he now tries what must be the most British method ever of murder. And there's no axe in the back here or anything. The murder weapon of choice was an arsenic-laden scone. And the famous phrase, which was repeated at court, was "excuse fingers," as he politely passed the scone to the other solicitor, who ate it, but was violently ill but not dead, and he fled for his life. The police were called, and Scotland Yard were called in. Who did they call in? Brother Spilsbury, you can see with his microscope there, and Brother Wilcox. They quickly they exhumed the wife. She's been dead for several years, but her skeleton is riddled with arsenic. The scones, there's crumbs, they've got arsenic in them. The chocolates have got arsenic. He's arrested by a detective sergeant from his own lodge who finds arsenic in his pocket. So there's a pretty strong case against him. He actually appeared at Hereford Crown Court, which was designed by Robert Smirke, a Freemason who designed the British Museum. And the foreman of the jury, who stood up and said guilty, was also a member of his lodge. And that was a finish of him, and he was hanged. And it does give me some perverse pleasure as a retired detective to see a solicitor hanged. That's just a personal thing. You have to forgive me that indulgence. But this is a scandal worthy of the... I was disappointed being British at the Jimmy Savile and the Cyril Smith cover-ups. And this is probably just as bad, and it involves the murder of the Grand Master of England. This is the Duke of Devonshire, who was the Grand Master in the post-war years, up until his death in 1950. Duke of Devonshire was a very powerful man. He was on Churchill's cabinet in the war. His sister, who you can see in the bottom right, was married to Macmillan, the Prime Minister, Lady Dorothy there. His son was engaged to JFK's sister. The Dukes of Devonshire have a beautiful home, you can see in the centre there, in Derbyshire, and they don't have a holiday home in Eastbourne, which you can see in the top centre. They actually own Eastbourne. The entire town belongs to them. But this is not a good place to have a heart attack in 1950, which he does, because the GP there was one Bodkin Adams. Bodkin Adams is probably worse than Shipman. He likely to have killed 250 to 300 people, usually rich widows, putting them to sleep. But he was very kind and nice with them before he did it, and they left him 2 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost cars, vast sums of money and property, and he lived in that 17-bedroom house there. And he went around bumping off people in Eastbourne for 10 to 15 years until he was eventually brought to trial at the Old Bailey and got off. So how did he get away with it? Well, the person to blame, in my view, is Manningham Buller, who's the Attorney General, bottom left. Manningham Buller, who was obviously controlled by the government, he had to pick the case. And in the 50s, you could only be tried for one murder at a time. And so he picked a case where the body had been cremated, so there was little evidence there. All sorts of notes and medical histories went missing or ended up with a defence. Why is he doing this? Well, the NHS is very new, so the last thing the government need is a doctor swinging from the end of a rope. The British Medical Association sort of collaborated, and they told no other doctors to give evidence. The homosexual police chief the police chief in Eastbourne, he didn't want any trouble either, because this is the 1950s. I mean, today in the police, it's probably criteria for promotion. I'm only glad I got out before it's compulsory, but he didn't want any trouble. And also that Manningham Buller, he's related to the Duke of Devonshire, and he knows that the Duke's sister, Lady Dorothy, you can see again there with Macmillan, who married to Macmillan, she was actually having sex with Lord Boothby, who you can see below, who was also having sex ultimately with Ronnie Craig. So the net result of all this scandal and manipulation of evidence results in Bodkin Adams getting a not guilty. And the moment he was given a not guilty verdict, the Attorney General handed him a letter, like Tony Blair gave to the IRA men, saying you can't be retried, or you can't be tried for any other murders. At which point, so fast in the court that the judge intervened, but it was too late. He had the letter, and so he got off. And the question is, though, is why did he kill the Grand Master? Because if you look at rich widows, you can understand there's some element of greed as a motive, but with Shipman, they found it went more than that, because there's a psychological thing about I decide who lives and dies. But again, if we look into Bodkin Adams' life, he was a member of the Plymouth Brethren, which is a sort of bizarre religious sect, which claims that Freemasons are the devil. So is that why he murdered the Grand Master? In any case, he got away with it. And if anybody thinks Freemasonry is all powerful, how can you kill the Grand Master of England and get a not guilty and walk away? Scandalous. But you'll be pleased to know that none of the great train robbers were Freemasons. But this entire crime, and I'll show you the Masonic connection in a minute, but this entire crime happened because it was a Scottish bank holiday. So in the train used to be moved from Scotland down to the south of England to London, full of money on a post office carriage. But as it was a Scottish bank holiday, it had 5 times as much money in it. Now, the South London villains had a very good plan. They adjusted the signal, they covered up the go signal and shorted it so the red light came on. So the train was stopped. Now, the idea was that Ronnie Biggs, who's the subject of this story, Ronnie Biggs was to hire Ronnie Biggs was to obtain a driver to cut off the high value packages carriage and move it forward to the bridge you can see on the top left. Ronnie Biggs recruited a man who could only drive Thomas the Tank Engine, so they had to whack the driver, Jack Mills. No one likes violence, but the train was moved forward, and they stole the equivalent in today's money of £30 million, which they moved down that embankment into army lorries and drove 17 miles away to Leatherslade Farm, which you can see at the bottom left. Second mistake. Well, they had so much money in that farm, they were playing Monopoly with real cash. And that in the centre, you can see the Monopoly set in the Thames Valley Police Museum, which I went to see. And you can also see the pickaxes and axes they used to get in the train. But the second mistake, they thought the police were onto them and didn't burn the farm down. They just fled. So the farm is full of fingerprint evidence. Now, the farm was discovered by Brian Woolley, a young policeman who is a Freemason. He's in his 80s now, Brian, and he was telling me that he was frightened out of his wits, but he found the farm, and the Scotland Yard flying squad was called in, and the fingerprint experts, one of them I met again, of course, is a Freemason, and the villains were quickly arrested, as you can see, including Ronnie Biggs. But Ronnie Biggs jumped over the wall of Wandsworth Prison. You can see onto that furniture van. He then went to France and had a plastic surgery. He changed his face, and that's significant in this story. He then went to Australia, and then we all know he ended up in Rio. But of course, the 1970s, the police don't know this. And so Scotland Yard was sending detectives all over the world to find Biggs. And the man chosen to go to Rio was a detective sergeant called Brian Marshall. Now, I've spoken to Brian, and of course, he's a Freemason. And he said, I've got my tickets and orders to go to Rio. He said, but I was going to be on my own. So the next thing I did, I walked out of Scotland Yard and I wandered up to Covent Garden to go to Grand Lodge. And I spoke to Grand Lodge of England and said, you know, is there a lodge I can go to in Rio? And they said, oh yeah, there's a lodge there and it's full of expats, British. Here's the address. So he went to Rio, he made some inquiries and got nowhere really. But then he went to the lodge meeting, and at the lodge meeting he said, has anybody seen anybody new Englishmen in town? And somebody said, yeah, there's a guy who calls himself Michael, who's a chippy, he does odd jobs. And so he arranged to meet this man by the cafe, by that big statue of Christ you can see. Now, when Brian Marshall, Brother Marshall, saw this man coming up the hill, he thought, well, he does look a bit like Biggs, but of course he's had plastic surgery, so he doesn't know. So they had a cup of tea together and discussed fictitious work. And when the man left, Brother Marshall scooped up his cup and saucer and shoved them in his bag. He ran down the hill to the British Embassy, and the embassy flew that cup and saucer to Heathrow. It was couriered to the yard. And at Scotland Yard, the fingerprint expert said it was Ronnie Biggs who had his hands on that cup and saucer. So it was intelligence gained at a Masonic meeting that found Ronnie Biggs in Rio. So if you think you've had some good conversations, that's probably the best one. But what about these two? These two, the Cray twins, vicious gangsters in 60s London. You'll be pleased to know they're not Freemasons, albeit I think they would make either a good treasurer or a good charity steward if you needed such. But Ronnie, who's in the foreground, he shot George Cornell in the face in the Blind Beggar pub, you can see, and then his half-same brother Reg stabbed to death Jack the Hat McVitie in a flat in East London. What's the Masonic connection? It's a good one. They were arrested by a Freemason, Brother Nipper Reed. You can see I went to see Nipper, He died recently. He's 92, but he's a lovely man. And I said to him, Nipper, you've been in the lodge 50 odd years. Like, why have you never been the master? And he said, oh, it would have been hard work. I imagine it was harder work catching the Craterans, but a top man and a Freemason we can be proud of. But let me tell you this story. This shows how, and you might have to help me with the pronunciation here, actually, but this shows how accusations that Freemasons let people off at court is a nonsense. So in the 90s, Tony Williams was the Deputy Director of Finance at Scotland Yard. So he controlled millions of pounds. He also controlled the IRA Informers Fund. And you can imagine that the less people who know who's being paid, the better. So he had a blank check, basically, and he signed them himself. And he actually wrote himself out checks to the value of £5 million. And he set himself up, bearing in mind he lives in Surrey, he set himself up as the Laird of Toomington and in the Highlands. And what he did, he bought the hotel and the golf club and everything. And everybody in the village there thought he was a wonderful man because he supplied all this work and he did up all these facilities. But at one point, somebody in Scotland Yard said, there's a lot of money going missing here. What's going on here? So they started to investigate it. And the man tasked to investigate it is on the bottom left. That's Commander George Churchill Coleman, a lovely man. And he was one of the assistant provincial Grand Masters in Surrey. He was in charge of the Scotland Yard bomb squad. And he investigated it. And his sergeant came to see him and said, Governor, I've found out who's doing this. It's a man called Tony Williams, who's also a Surrey Freemason. And he said words to the effect of, I really don't care what he is, get him arrested and get him here. So Williams was arrested and he appeared at the Old Bailey in front of Judge Verney, who you can see there. Judge Verney was the Deputy Provincial Grand Master in Buckinghamshire. And during the course of the trial, Tony Williams made all sorts of Masonic signs and all this sort of business, and he was eventually found guilty. And he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And after the trial, Judge Verney called in George Churchill Coleman and said that character was going to get 5 years, but he got 7 for that performance. So it just shows that Freemasons like Judge Verney and George Churchill Coleman have got real honour. And so that man actually received more punishment for being stupid. So a good time. Bear with me. So in conclusion, there's always been, some people get the hump about these things. Oh, I don't like it. But you've got to appreciate that in any organisation, there are good and bad people. And the Masonic ritual, now you have to help me if this is in Scottish craft ritual. It's certainly in English craft ritual. But you can see there the first degree tracing board. And on the first degree tracing board, particularly in England, there are 4 tassels that you can see in the corner, which it says represents prudence, temperance, fortitude and justice. And the ritual goes on to say, all of which virtues were practiced by the great majority of the ancient Freemasons. Not all, great majority. Because if you've done your 3rd degree, you know that 3 Master Masons bumped off Hiram Abiff, and 12 had a good think about it. So that's 15 bad ones that the ritual actually acknowledges exist. So anybody who says Freemasonry is perfect, no, it's not. It's not perfect at all. And so we have to acknowledge that this evil man, Kenneth Noy, who was offence for the Brinksmatch robbery, murdered a police officer, John Fordham, and a young lad on the M20. We have to acknowledge he was a Freemason. He was, but we can say that he was bad and he was thrown out. Likewise, Seddon, the Scouser, who tried to make Masonic signs, he was hanged. And this lunatic Breivik, I went to Norway. I went to Norway to help the Norwegian police after his bombings and shootings. But again, he was, as soon as they found out he was bad, after 4 meetings, that's all he'd been in, he was thrown out. But for every one of these bad people, I suggest there's 10,000 good Masons. And I'd like to draw your attention to this Scotsman here. This is Jim Morrison. So Jim Morrison, as I say, originally from Scotland, but he was a Metropolitan Police detective in the East End. And he was off duty in 1991, late towards Christmas, and he was waiting for his wife in Covent Garden. Many of you have probably been there, particularly if you've been to Grand Lodge in England. And he saw a bag theft. Now, he could have ignored it, of course, but he didn't. He chased the man, and the killer's never been, he was found stabbed to death, and the killer's never been found. And that plaque, I went on the 25th anniversary of it, actually, but if you're ever in London, that plaque is just near the Indian Embassy at the Aldwych. And so finally, it was a Mason who brought all these scoundrels to justice after the London riots. That was me. And you heard about my work with human super recognizers. If you look at the bottom, it was one of them who had identified the man in the red mask and the black hat as the man you can see in the photograph. Now, no facial recognition machine could do that, but a human can. So that's part of my work there. And here's another case, which is a less successful conclusion. I failed in my hunt for the body, but if any of you old chap have got information, there's a Crime Stoppers number. And so if you do come to London, please come with me. I'll show you all these places exist. And there we are. Any questions?
Mike, on behalf of the assembled brethren, can I thank you so much for a very intriguing insight into some of our country's most infamous characters. Not only the crafts infamous characters, and I'm sure we will have quite a few questions for you. But just to start them off, I've actually got two for you.
Yeah.
The book The Brotherhood by Stephen Knight and the follow-up by Martin Short, Inside the Brotherhood, casts particularly English policemen and Freemasonry in a very bad light. What's your views on those two gentlemen and their books? Well,
the books they're not very well researched. For example, if you read, like I said about John Meiklejohn, the guy from near Stirling, they claim he was a Freemason. The Knight makes all sorts of accusations about Jack the Ripper and Freemasonry, which are very easily disproved, and he misses out half the people who were Freemasons. And I think the nicest comment on Amazon about my book, Crime and the Craft, you can see there, is that it's balanced. So I've given like an honest insight into this. There are some goodies, but there are also lots of, there's some baddies, but there are lots of goodies, like most of the forensic science developments were by Freemasons. So I think what Knight did and the follow-on book, they just grab hold of half a story and then make it as bad as possible. And you can see the confusion in this trial of the detectives, that some of the Masons are goodies, some of the Masons are baddies. The Mason who's a baddie is arrested by a Mason. Half the solicitors were Masons. The barristers who prosecuted were Masons. So it's a confusing world, and those books are written from a very anti-Masonic viewpoint rather than a facts-based viewpoint.
Okay, thank you. I would encourage any of the brethren here who've not read either of the books, just to read them. As Bob Cooper would say about Masonic phobia, it's good to see what our detractors actually write about us. They are like entertainment, brethren, I would say that. So do we have any questions for Mike Byrne? So from Ian Walk, Mike, for you.
Yeah.
Is Freemasonry perfect?
No, well, just perfect and regular, I suppose. But no organisation's ever going to be perfect. We can be very careful about who we bring in, and we can be very good about our aims. But human nature is flawed. So just like there are bad Catholic priests or bad corrupt detectives or a rogue scout leader or whatever, a bent judge. But the vast majority of Catholic priests or Freemasons or scout leaders are decent, honourable men who want to do the right thing to help society. So I think in any organisation, you know, I went to the Athenaeum Club in London, and it's got some great members there. You know, Robbie Burns, Rudyard Kipling, Duke of Wellington, and then it's like Karl Marx, Jimmy Savile. You know, so it's awful. You know, so every organisation is going to have bad people. I mean, look, thank the Lord that Cyril Smith and Jimmy Savile weren't Freemasons, else would have been tarred with their brush as well. So no, we're not perfect, but no one. Honour the Lord. Honour the Lord is perfect.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the museum a few times. Are there, somebody just added another one, are there many Freemasonic articles in there? And if so, what's their stories?
Well, the stories are what I've told, really. So in the museum, the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard, it was called the Black Museum, but they had to change the name. But the Crime Museum, they put some of the articles in the public domain. So they've got the pistol that you know Ronnie Cray shot George Connor in the face with. When I mentioned about Brother Seddon, they've got the medicine bottle he used. Hay the same. They've got the same. All the documents. They've got the letter from Brother Bucknell who hanged Brother Seddon. So they've got all those sort of artifacts. They've got some wonderfully awful things as well. I don't know if you know about another Scotsman actually who wasn't a Freemason, was Dennis Nielsen, who was as a soldier. He's a catering corps guy, and then he was a policeman for a short while. But what he used to do is he used to he was gay, and he would meet men and kill them, and then dress them so they were waiting for him when he came home. So it was called killing for company, so he wasn't on his own. But he used to chop them up and dispose of them. And he used to boil their heads up in a pan, a big pot, and then flush it down the toilet. But he used to also make a curry for his job centre people using the same pot. So they found out after he was convicted that the pot they'd been eating the curry out of, he'd been boiling people's heads in. But that pot is in the museum with the cookery cooked on. So there's some rather macabre items in there.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Before I ask you the next question, I'm going to ask for my lawyer to be present to suggest that I'm only asking the question on behalf of this brother, and he's asking where can he get flypaper? Let's see.
Any good DIY shop, I imagine.
Let's see. So I
remember what I told him. Remember what I told him. Remember what I said. Don't do one big dose. That's crazy.
So did you get that past provincial grandmaster of Stirlingshire? Do it gently. Mike, who's the worst person you've arrested, both ordinary and Freemason?
I can't honestly say I've arrested a Freemason. No one's ever identified. So the most horrible person I dealt with was a man who, I can understand people who rob banks. I come from a council estate, so I can understand who organise bank robbery. I can quite admire them in a way, and it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, catch them, cops and robbers. You know, when you arrest them, I can get on with people. I ran criminals who were informants who would tell me, you know, who's committing bank robberies, who's committing shootings and stuff, and I could get on with criminals. And it's a dirty job, but you have to do that. The worst one I dealt with was a man who used to go to the Oval Cricket Ground, and he would make friends with the parents, with a young lad, and say, "Look, you don't have to come tomorrow, and I'll look after him." And in cricket, I don't know if you know this, but you have a scorecard, and you'd have the boy putting in his lap and have a thrill as the lad marked off the scores. And when we're taking his fingerprints, because you used to do it like manually then by taking somebody's finger and rolling it with ink, and he said to me, "Oh, I'm getting a thrill by you touching my fingers." And I said, "If you carry on, I'll rip the fingers out of the socket," like, you know, because it was just such a disgusting, vile individual. Like I said, I could handle people who rob banks. It's not right, but I could understand why they did it. But I couldn't understand his filthy, disgusting motives.
I think many of us on here this evening can appreciate where you're coming from with that. A comment. One of the Bren, Chris McPherson's done the Ripper walking tour, and the guy mentioned masonry, and Chris says he shut up about the Masons after I told him I was one. Is that common? Do you think?
It is. There's one chap there, you know, because I do my own. I can take you around and I can show you this place and talk about all the Masons involved. But some of them talk about this Masonic conspiracy theory, and as soon as you challenge them, they don't have the answers, you see, because they've not done the research. Because, for example, if you've ever seen that film From Hell, what you have is you have Fred Aberline, who's like the equivalent of the detective inspector. So Swanson, who I spoke about, the Scotsman from Thurso, he was like the DCI, and then below him was Fred Aberline, who was he was like on the ground. And in the film From Hell, the Masons, who've got this big plot, try and kill him. And I always say, well, it can't have been that bad, because Fred Aberline joined Freemasonry in 1889. And his sergeant, who you see, if you watch the films with like Johnny Depp and Robbie Coltrane, the sergeant who Robbie Coltrane plays, he also joined Freemasonry. So it's like a fantasy land. And when they're challenged, they can't add it up. And just by way of example, the East End is rough now. In 1888, it was like, you know, you'd be mad to walk round there. So the idea of a toff walking around the East End, he'd be, to murder people, he'd be murdered before he murdered anybody else. You know, he'd be murdered and robbed and sent on his way. So I think it's a fantasy, and it's good to challenge these things.
Okay. Mike, good to see you, brother. This is from Harry's iPad. What's the prospect of a lecture on your current enterprise?
Current enterprise in what sense? Does he mean about my super recognizer work or the research I do? What does he mean?
I think he's nodding his head at me here. I think he's talking about the super recognizer work.
Oh yeah, so I do that. So I give lectures in lodges, and there's a Masonic twist to it actually. So what is really bizarre? So in about 5 years ago, the Times approached me, the Times newspaper, because there's some iconic footage from the First World War, where a man is carrying a comrade through the trench, and the soldier in question carrying the man has got no tunic or hat on, so there's no regimental distinguishing features, and this footage is on every Great War documentary, and the Times said 20 people have said that's my granddad. And so we employed a super recognizer to go through all the photographs and say, it's this guy here from the Durham Light Infantry. A friend of mine joined the lodge and we did some research, and it turns out that the man who made the film was in my lodge. So the man who made the film was in my lodge, and 100 years later, I was asked to identify it. So I said, what's the chances of that? So there's a Masonic twist to the super recognizer tale, but I certainly would gladly give a talk on that, and I do that in several. I've done that in several lodges.
Okay, thank you. These presentations will be going on for many months, I believe, so I might be knocking on your door, Mike.
No problem.
So, a question from Ian Kennedy. In the Stephen Lawrence case, was there any suggestion of a Masonic cover-up?
Well, there's certain people involved. If you saw the death in the car park or something, it was on the TV recently where Daniel Morgan had an axe put through his head. He was a private investigator. There's a man involved in that called Sid Fillery. He was a detective sergeant, eventually convicted of child paedophilia, but he was a Mason at some point. But no, not really. Some of those characters in that were involved in the initial Stephen Lawrence carry on. But to my experience of the police is that the Stephen Lawrence case was not racist in any way. It was just bungling and incompetent, and it was procedural. So in the police, what used to happen with murders is that if there was a murder, if you were a good working detective, you get put on the murder squad because it was a bit of a reward because you got lots of overtime. And stage 1 was gather the evidence, stage 2 was speak to the witnesses, stage 3 and stage 4 was arrest the suspect. But they couldn't cope with it if stage 4 came before stage 2, and it was just it was really badly handled. And after that, of course, they got proper murder squads now, but it's just, I think, more incompetence than anything else. But I don't think there's any Masonic conspiracy, no.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Another question from Chris McPherson, and I've heard of this case. Calvi in the 80s.
Oh, right, yes. I'll tell you.
P2.
Yeah, so Calvi, Roberto Calvi, he's in the book. So Roberto Calvi, he was the head of the Banco Ambrosio in Milan, which controlled money for the mafia, the Vatican, and the P2 or Propagandae Due Lodge, which met in Rome, which consisted of Italian fascists and South American dictators. The United Grand Lodge of England, I think, would call it a special interest lodge, if you like that sort of thing. But in the end, what happened was Calvi's bank started to collapse. His secretary jumped out the 10th floor window, as you do, and he fled to England in like a James Bond style helicopter, speedboat. He ended up in some dodgy hotel in West London, and then he was next found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge with dollars and bricks in his pocket. No one's ever sure what happened. Was it the mafia, the Vatican, or the Masons who did him in? Having looked at the membership of P2, I think we're fairly safe on this because one of their members was Berlusconi. I mean, who could believe he'd be involved in anything dishonest? So I don't think we'll ever solve that. But P2 was a proper lodge. He could have attended a lodge in England or Scotland at the time. And of course, not anymore. But yeah, Calvi's in my presence. Take you to the place where he was dangling, if you want.
Okay. A question from the Provincial Grand Master of Argyll and Isles, Brother Dougie Fyland. He starts it off, Mike, with excellent lecture. And he's asking, did you ever come across a prominent Argyll Mason, the late past Master George Lyle, who was in the police in London for many years and was a member of St Molio's 774 in Arran?
No, I'm sorry, sir. I've not heard of him, but you've got to imagine that the Met is vast. There's 30,000 offices in London. You know, it dwarfs. I mean, I don't know how many. I mean, of course, Scotland at the time had about 6 or 7 forces. Now you've got Police Scotland, but even that's not as big. I don't think. I think it's second to the Met. So no, I don't know the name. But if he does send me some details, if you email me, I'll find out some. I'll find out where he was.
Okay, Dougie, if you drop me a message afterwards, I'll make sure Mike gets that. Here's another interesting question. Have you ever been impressed with a criminal or a crime?
Yes, I was always impressed by the organ. I remember we arrested a guy who he was going to do a security van robbery. You know, they're always very well planned out, and it's like it is literally like cops and robbers. So I could get on with people who committed good, organised. When I say good, I mean well organised crime, because it was my job to catch them. So. Yeah, I could be impressed by people organising things. The key thing is, I always found with crime is there's 3 rules. Don't be lazy, so travel around. Don't do it in the same place unless you get caught out. Don't be violent, because no one likes that. No one likes anybody hurting. And don't be greedy. So if you steal too much, like the great train robbers, people will be onto you. So if you're prepared to abide by those rules, you'll get away with a lot. That's why fraudsters get away with so much these days. But yeah, I quite go on with the armed robbers. I remember once driving at 70, well, I wasn't driving, but somebody was driving at 70 miles an hour. We were driving at 70 miles an hour through central London to keep up with a team of robbers. And we had these big pickaxe handles, and we were driving so fast. And when they robbed it, we jumped out and we hit them with these big sticks. It was like getting paid for a game, really, of playing rugby. So it was, you know, I thought people on a stag night had paid to be involved in this. So, yeah, I quite enjoy, I like catching criminals. I still help the police today, so yeah, good fun.
Another question about your time in the police. As a policeman and a detective in London, were you ever under pressure from superiors?
Yes, it could be quite. The police are very political, and I remember when I was in charge of all the identifications in the London riots. So we had, you know, thousands of images of people to identify. And one of the commanders tried to pressure me into bending the rules to get the identifications. And I had to say, no, I'm not going to do that. We're going to do this properly. Because all he was interested in is political expediency and going and telling the Prime Minister that we'd identified so many people. And of course, the cases would have then fallen apart at court because the identifications were flawed. So I had to stand up to people. I mean, I revealed, for example, that if you want to look me up on Google, I said that the CCTV in London was an utter fiasco. And people tried to destroy me because of that. They'd rather destroy the messenger or kill the messenger than deal with the problem. So the police is very politicised, and people who want to get on are happy to see bad things happen. So yes, they will put pressure on, but I'm the wrong person. I won't stand for it. They can be bullying and nasty, but I stood up to them and they didn't like it. So sodom.
Okay. Are new police recruits asked if they're Freemasons?
No. So what happened with that? So when I first joined Freemasonry in '95, a couple of years later, a letter came out saying you have to declare, or you have to say, I am a Freemason, I am not a Freemason, or I am not prepared to say if I'm a Freemason or not. But within a couple of months, the whole thing was stopped because there was a court case in Italy where a municipal council had tried the same thing with employees, and it was declared illegal by the European Court of Human Rights. So they can't do that. Okay.
A question from one of Scotland's finest. Back in the day, he wore a uniform. Were any of the Met commissioners in the craft?
It was Sir Charles Warren, who was the commissioner at the time of the Jack the Ripper killings, as I've noted, but none as I know since. And certainly, it's turned on its head, because of the top 40 Met officers, from the commanders, deputy assistant commissioner, and commissioner, none of those, to my knowledge, are Freemasons anymore. You know, there was a heyday in the 60s where commanders would have been Freemasons, like Nipper Reid went on to be the head of the regional crime squad and the like. No, not anymore. But the only commissioner I know of is Warren.
Okay, we've got a comment from Stuart Donaldson. We lodges in Scotland have had a couple of famous poisoners as well. Stuart, do you want to unmute yourself and enlighten us and enlighten Mike?
Well, it's the famous Pritchard in Glasgow.
Right.
The nickname, the Human Crocodile.
The human.
And the other one, Marie Chantrell, Lodge Canongate winning.
Right.
A couple of famous poisoners. I've just finished writing the story of Chantrell, funny enough, for a newsletter. And it seems that in Canongate winning, the day after he got hung, they called a special meeting to pick somebody else for the committee.
in London, one of the lodges, one of the guys was hanged, and he said in the minutes he'd gone away. Well, Stuart, would you mind sharing those stories with me via Gordon, would you please?
Yeah, certainly.
It'd be wonderful. And you could tell me the lodges they're in.
I'll copy out your email and I'll send them to you. How's that?
That's smashing. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem.
Thank you, Stuart. The final question I think we've got in the chat room for you, Mike. I saw a lecture in Edinburgh St Andrews, number 48, where the speaker spoke about the links to Jack the Ripper. And he was speaking about various things he did and tried to link him to the Masons. Oh, it's just a comment. At that time, I thought total speculation. So I think you've just further enhanced Brother Finlay Ross's Masonic knowledge this evening.
There's no link to the ritual at all when you look at the deaths, and you look at the Freemasons who are out their way trying to prove the killings. So it's a nonsense, and so. You know, I can give hopefully I'll get up to the lovely Scotland and give a talk on Jack the Ripper. And like I say, it was probably a Scottish Freemason who solved it. So even better.
No, that's great. Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to take this as a final question, and then I'll do the intimations and the thank you to Mike, and then we'll do what we normally do, Brian, open mics, and allow you to say your own personal thank yous to Brother Mike Neville for his presentation evening. So the final question, should new potential Masons be CRB checked?
It's very difficult because, of course, you know, they'd have to fill in the forms themselves and do that. But the trouble with the CRB checks, I don't think they're called CRB anymore.
They're not up here, yeah.
Whatever the name they got. But they only really rely on what address you give, you know. So like Ian Huntley, who killed the two girls in Cambridgeshire, because his local record of being suspected was in Lincolnshire, it wasn't picked up. So it only does so much. So it's no definite thing anyway. And then they wouldn't have to put down the spent convictions. So I don't think it would take us much further, to be honest.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. On behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi and all our visitors here this evening, can I give you a heartfelt thank you for a really interesting presentation into the seedier side of life. Yeah. And I'm sure that everyone here has really enjoyed what they've heard and what they've learned. Brian, just a few announcements. It's quite interesting that Brother Stuart mentioned the Lodge Canongate winning number 2, as on Thursday evening, the Grand Lodge of Scotland History and Heritage Group will be presenting their 5th in their series of Scotland's oldest lodges, and it is Canongate winning number 2. And I'm sure the part about the poisoner won't be in Malcolm McRae's presentation. But I would encourage you to join that on Thursday evening, Brian. Next week we have Brother Frederick Vouth. He's a French Freemason, and he's going to come and talk to us about the history of French Freemasonry. And it goes right back and talks about the difference between Freemasonry in the Great British Isles and what was more termed continental Freemason. And there's a very nice link on from Ian's presentation about the Jacobites. So, Brian, I would encourage you to come along to that. The YouTube channel is now up and running, Brian, and we have our lockdown lecture series are all uploaded. And over the last weekend, I've uploaded 8 of the Sankey lectures from Canada that are very interesting, Brian. And there's another 27 lectures now uploaded. So there's 50 lectures on our YouTube channel now for you to go in at your own time during lockdown to while away the hours. So, Brian, once again, thank you all for the support to the Lodge Hope of Karachi in our lockdown lecture series. And Brian, I will unmute you all so you can say your thank yous and good nights. That's you unmuted, Brian.
Thank you, Mike. That was
Thanks very much.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike.
presentation.
Excellent
Thank you very much.
presentation. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Enjoyable. Thank you.
Mike, enjoy it.
Thank you, Mike. Enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very much, Mike. That's the second time I've heard your lecture. It's fantastic.
Oh, thanks. Cheers, Tom.
It gets better every time.
Brethren, I'm off. I've got to cook dinner.
Super.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Thank you. I'll be in touch.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Cheers, Gordon and Mike. Thanks very much.
The book is available on Amazon, brother, and there's only 7 copies left according to the chat room. So I'm sure Mike will be able to
Buy them
speak to the
from me.
publishers.
Buy them from me, Gordon.
Okay, do you?
I can
Okay.
sign them.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye. Cheers, Mike. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay, Brian, I'm going to give you 5, 4,
Thank you,
Good night, everybody. Thanks,
3,
Gordon. Stay safe, everybody.
2,
Gordon.
1. Thank you and good evening, Brian.
Good night.